Hey guys, welcome back to another Intro to Python video. Today we're going to be talking about numbers and numeric operations. Let's just jump into it. So when I say numbers, you can use your big brain and probably figure out that I'm talking about things like 2, 25, 256, 256.6, etc. And all these are numbers in Python, and there's actually a bunch of different types of numbers, 2 that are important and 1 that's only for nerds. So basically the types of numbers in Python are int, float, and complex. Don't worry about the last one. You can actually forget I said it, but I'm just going to cover it for the sake of it. Int is going to be your integers. These are your whole numbers, as low as you want to go, as high as you want to go. We can actually check the type of whatever we want, really, with this great Python function type. If you just do type, then you put in these parentheses, the Python cell will print out the type of whatever's inside the parentheses. So if I did type 1, we can tell that 1 is an int. Type of -1 would also be an int. If I did type of -1 point, this is now a float, which is just a number that has a decimal in it. So because this has a decimal point here, the implication is that there's a 0, right? There doesn't have to be. Just having the dot there is enough to make this number a float. Any number that has a decimal in it is a float. Any whole number is an int. Now, the third type of number is the complex number, and to make a complex number, you're actually going to call another Python built-in function, complex. You're just going to put in your first number and your second number, and you're going to get nice little imaginary numbers for all you scientists with your big brains, right? Okay, awesome. You can basically forget about complex number. We're not going to be doing much with it in this series. Now, once we have these numbers, we're going to want to manipulate them and get the output that we're looking for, whatever function we're trying to do, right? We have our basics and our funky functions for that. I'm not going to tell you what the funky ones are right now, but I mean, you can probably imply the basics. They are add, subtract, multiply, and divide. In Python, your add is just a simple plus, so 1 + 1 = 2. Now, this is where it gets a little bit fun. When you add an int and an int right there, the type of that output is an int. But if I added a int and a float, 1 and 1.0, the output is now a float. And then if I added a float, 1.5, and another float, 1.0, the output is also a float. And pay special attention to that, because once we get into the funky functions, as well as the dividing, multiplying, this gets a little bit intricate. Subtraction, very similar. You're just going to do a minus. Honestly, super straightforward. Python's a pretty readable language as far as programming languages go. And what we did here was we did a float to a float. So as you can probably guess, the type of this output is going to be a float. Then if we did an int and a float, int minus a float, or a float minus an int, we're also going to get a float output. If you want an integer output, you're going to have to do integer, integer. There's also a few other ways to manipulate it, but we're going to get to that down the line. But we'll just leave these here. We'll leave the 1 + 1 as our addition, and then we can go and make code cells for subtract, divide, and multiply. For subtraction, we're going to do 2 - 3.1, and then for division, it's pretty straightforward as well. If we wanted to say do 3 divided by 3, it's just a single slash. Now, as you can see, the output of 3 divided by 3 is a float, despite being given 2 ints. Now, if you also give it a float and an int, like 3 and 3.0, you're going to also get that float output. And then if you wanted to do a float and a float, say 3.0 and 3.0, likewise, you're going to get the float output. So when you're dividing two numbers, the output, despite whether you put in an int and a float, or an int and an int, or a float and a float, your output is a float value. And we can go ahead and verify that if we run a float divided by a float, float divided by an int, and an int divided by an int, all outputs are a float. Now, with multiplication, this is a bit different. So if you did 2 times 2, we're going to get 4. As you can see there, it looks like an int. Let's go ahead and verify that. And yes, in fact, it is an int. Now, if we did this with 2 and say 2.5, while it would give you that normal 5 value, it is a float. And then if we did a whole, let's say 2.0 and 2.5, we're also going to get a float output. So as you can tell here, the basic operations tend to drift towards float values as they output. We've covered the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. The basic functions, we can go ahead and get into those funky functions, and it is getting a little bit hot in here. So we're getting into our exponential, our floor division, and our modular division. Now exponential is represented with 2 asterisks. So if I did something like 7 asterisk asterisk 2, we're gonna get 7 squared, which comes out to 49. Now modular division is represented by a percent sign, and what it's doing is telling us the remainder. So something like 7 modular division 7 is going to return 0, right? But something like 8 modular division 7 is going to return 1. And something like 18 modular division 7 is going to return 4, because you get 7, 14, 14, 18, there's a difference of 4 there. Floor division, on the other hand, is telling us the number of times the value on the right goes into the value on the left. So while modular division 7 into 7 gave us a 0, floor division 7 into 7 will give us a 1. And floor division 14 into 7 would give us 2. Now, as you can see with these 3 functions, every time I put in an int and an int, we got out an int value, right? So when I did 7 squared, we got 49. 7 into 7 modular, or 14 into 7 floor division, all comes out with a integer value. That's different than the basic functions, where when you do an int divided by an int, you're getting out a float value. Now, if I did something like 7 to the half power, which for all you big brains is the same as the square root of 7, right? We will get out a float value. And these float values only go for about 17 decimal points. So let's take something like 1,000 and go to the square root. We're still only seeing about 17 points here. This is different than, let's say I go 1,000 to the 5th. We are going to get out a pretty long number. And then if I went, say, 1,000 to the 579th, we just get out this massively long number, right? But if I did 1,000 to the 0.579, it only comes out with about 17 decimal points. Additionally, with that modular division, if I did something like 7.0 into 7, we do get out a float value. And if I did something like 15, 7.0, we are going to get out a float value of 1.0 instead of that int 1 when we did 15 to 7. This also applies to floor division. So if I did something like 7 point into 14, instead of getting out 2, we're going to get out 2.0. So it goes from the int to the float value. This is also true if we go something that doesn't work cleanly. Let's say 7 point into 17, we're going to get out that 2.0 again. And if we did that up here with the modular division, let's just move it down here. We'll get that 3.0 because you go 7, 14 with the remainder of 3. But since it's a float value that's being represented, when you're putting it in, it comes out as a float value. And that just about wraps it up for basic numbers and arithmetic in Python. In the next video, we're going to be talking about variables and how you could set a number and manipulate it down the line in your program so that you're not stuck to the one cell like we were here. As always, homework in the description. Smash like! Subscribe.